I was 16 years old the first time my parents left me alone for more than a single night. It was December of 2009, the week between Christmas and New Year's, and they were driving to my aunt's house in Indiana for a family gathering I had begged out of attending, 3 states away, 3 days alone. I had convinced them I was responsible enough, mature enough, old enough to handle the farmhouse by myself while they were gone. The farmhouse had been in my mother's family for 4 generations. It sat at the end of a gravel road that stretched nearly a mile from the county highway, surrounded by fields that grew corn and soybeans in summer, but turned to frozen white emptiness when winter came. Our nearest neighbors were the Hendersons, and they lived almost 2 miles away across fields that might as well have been the surface of the moon once the snow started falling. I loved that house. I had grown up in it, learned to walk on its creaking floorboards, spent countless nights listening to the wind howl against windows that were older than my grandparents. But I had never been truly alone there. There had always been someone else in the house, someone to hear the sounds that old farmhouses make, someone to tell me that the creaking was just settling, and the scratching was just mice, and the footsteps were just my imagination. My parents left on the morning of December 27th. My mother hugged me 3 times and made me promise to call every night. My father showed me how to work the generator in case the power went out and reminded me where he kept the shotgun, though he made it clear I was only to use it in a genuine emergency. They drove away down the gravel road, their taillights disappearing into the gray winter morning, and I stood on the porch feeling the kind of freedom that only a 16-year-old can truly appreciate. The first 2 days were everything I had hoped for. I stayed up until 3 a.m. watching horror movies I was not supposed to watch. I ate cereal for dinner and pizza for breakfast. I blasted music through the empty rooms and danced like an idiot in the kitchen and called my friends to brag about my independence. The house felt like mine for the first time in my life, a kingdom of solitude where no one could tell me what to do or when to do it. The snow started falling on the evening of the second day. Light at first, just a dusting that made the fields sparkle under the porch light. But by midnight, it had turned into something serious. The wind picked up, driving the flakes sideways, piling drifts against the barn and the fence posts and the cars my father had left parked in the yard. I watched from the living room window, wrapped in a blanket, feeling safe and warm while the world outside turned white and hostile. I went to bed around 1 a.m., climbing the stairs to my bedroom on the 2nd floor. The house was quiet except for the wind, which moaned around the corners and rattled the old windows in their frames. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from 2 days of teenage excess. The scratching woke me at exactly 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone when my eyes snapped open, that instinctive reach for technology that my generation had developed. The sound was coming from downstairs, from the back of the house, from the door that led out to the yard and the barn and the endless white fields beyond. Scratching, not knocking, not banging, scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly down wood. I lay in bed and listened, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. I told myself it was a branch, maybe a piece of debris blown against the door by the wind, maybe an animal seeking shelter from the storm, a raccoon or a possum trying to find somewhere warm. But there were no trees near the back door. The closest tree was the old oak by the barn, at least 50 feet away, and the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It would scratch for exactly 10 seconds, then stop, 30 seconds of silence. Then it would start again, the same pattern, the same rhythm, over and over. I counted the intervals in the darkness of my bedroom, hoping to find some irregularity that would prove it was natural, that would prove the wind was responsible, or an animal was just doing what animals do. But the timing never varied. 10 seconds of scratching, 30 seconds of silence, 10 seconds of scratching, 30 seconds of silence. For 2 hours, I lay in bed and listened. I did not go downstairs. I did not look out the window. I did not do anything except pull my blanket tighter and stare at the ceiling and try to convince myself that there was an explanation for what I was hearing. The scratching stopped around 4:30 a.m. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and expectant, as if whatever had been making the sound was waiting for something. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I just lay there, watching the gray light of dawn slowly fill my room, waiting for morning to make everything safe again. When the sun was fully up, I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs. The house looked normal. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. Dishes piled in the sink, pizza box still open on the counter. The living room was undisturbed, blankets thrown across the couch where I had been watching movies. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Then I looked at the back door. The marks were impossible to miss. 5 parallel lines, carved into the white paint, running from about shoulder height down to the handle. They were deep enough to expose the raw wood beneath, gouged into the surface with what must have been considerable force. The paint had curled away from the scratches, revealing the pale grain underneath. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks. They were too high to be a raccoon, too precise to be a branch, too deliberate to be anything natural. Something had stood at my back door in the middle of the night and scratched at the wood like it was trying to get in. I checked the yard. The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn, leaving a pristine white blanket over everything. There were no footprints, no tracks leading to or from the door. Nothing to indicate that any living thing had approached the house during the night. But something had made those marks. Something had been there. I called my parents that afternoon. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried to explain what I had heard and what I had found without sounding like a frightened child. My mother listened patiently, then told me I was probably imagining things. "Old houses make strange sounds," she said. "The wind does strange things in winter. The marks were probably already there, and I just had not noticed them before." I knew she was wrong. I had used that door 100 times. I would have noticed gouges that deep, scratches that obvious. But I also knew she was 3 states away, and there was nothing she could do except worry. So I told her she was probably right and hung up the phone and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That night, the scratching came back. Same time, same pattern. 10 seconds of scratching, 30 seconds of silence. But this time, there was something else. Something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Breathing, heavy, labored breathing, audible even from my bedroom on the 2nd floor. The kind of breathing that comes from exertion, from effort, from something working hard at a task that required concentration. And between the breaths, fogging the small window set into the back door, was condensation. I could not see it from my room, but I knew it was there. I knew something was pressing its face against the glass, breathing on it, watching the fog form and fade with each exhale. I did not go downstairs. I did not even get out of bed. I just lay there in the darkness, listening to the scratching and the breathing, counting the intervals, praying for morning to come. It did eventually, and when I finally crept down to check the door, I found new marks, deeper this time, more desperate. The wood around the handle was beginning to splinter, as if something had been trying to pry it open with its fingers. I called my parents again. I was crying this time, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. I begged them to come home early. I told them something was wrong, that something was at the door every night, that I was scared. They told me I was being dramatic. They told me to lock the doors and stay inside and stop watching scary movies. They told me they would be home in 2 days and everything would be fine. 2 more nights. I had to survive 2 more nights. I did not sleep at all on the 4th night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house burning, the television playing at maximum volume, trying to drown out any sounds that might come from the back of the house. But around 2 a.m., even over the noise of the TV, I heard it. Scratching, breathing, and something new. A voice. It was not words, not exactly. More like a moan, a low sound that might have been trying to form language but could not quite manage it. It rose and fell with the rhythm of the scratching, a vocalization that accompanied the sound of fingernails on wood. I turned off the television. I do not know why. Some part of me needed to hear it clearly, needed to understand what was making that sound. The house fell silent except for the scratching and the breathing and the voice that was almost speaking but not quite. Then I heard something that stopped my heart. My name, muffled, distorted, barely recognizable, but my name, spoken through the door, shaped by a mouth that pressed against the wood and forced air through lips that were not quite working right. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom and did not come out until morning. My parents came home on the afternoon of December 31st. I met them in the driveway, practically throwing myself into my mother's arms, sobbing with relief. They looked at me like I had lost my mind. My father went straight to the back door to examine the damage I had described. I followed him, hanging back, not wanting to get too close. The marks were there, all of them. The scratches, the gouges, the splintered wood around the handle. My father stared at them for a long time, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern to something I had never seen on his face before. Fear. He knelt down and looked at the bottom of the door, at a section I had not examined closely. His face went pale. There were words carved into the wood, small letters, scratched into the paint with what must have been a fingernail or a sharp stone. The letters were crude but legible, formed by a hand that had practiced each stroke with deliberate precision. "Let me in." My father stood up slowly. He did not say anything. He just stared at the words, then looked out at the white fields stretching toward the horizon. We never found out what had come to our door that winter. My father replaced the entire door the following week, burning the old one in a barrel behind the barn. He did not want to look at those words anymore. Neither did I. We moved away from that farmhouse the following summer. My parents said it was for practical reasons, that they had found jobs closer to the city, that the commute had become too much. But I knew the real reason. We all knew. Something had been at our door every night for 4 nights. Something that could scratch through paint and wood. Something that breathed against the glass and tried to speak through the barrier that separated us. Something that knew my name and wanted to come inside. I am 31 years old now. I live in an apartment in the city, surrounded by neighbors, far from any farmhouse or empty field. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it, scratching, faint and distant, like a memory that will not fade. And I wonder if whatever stood at that door is still out there, still searching for the house at the end of the gravel road, still trying to find a way in. I wonder if it ever stopped looking. I wonder if it ever will. My grandmother died in September, and by November I had moved into her house. It was not a decision I made lightly. The Victorian had been in our family for over a century, built by my great-great-grandfather in 1891, passed down through generations of women who had lived and died within its walls. My grandmother had spent 63 years in that house, raised her children there, buried 2 husbands from its parlor, and finally passed away in the same bedroom where she had been born. The house sat on 3 acres at the edge of a town that had been slowly dying since the factories closed in the 70s. Our nearest neighbor was the Mercer family, who lived in a ranch house nearly half a mile down the road. Beyond them was nothing but fields and forests stretching toward the mountains that rose in the distance like sleeping giants. I was 28 years old and recently divorced, working remotely for a company that did not care where I lived as long as I met my deadlines. The house needed someone to care for it, and I needed somewhere to start over. It seemed like fate, or at least convenience. The first thing I noticed about the house was the heating system. My grandmother had been old-fashioned about many things, but she had allowed certain modernizations over the years. The original coal furnace in the basement had been converted to gas sometime in the 60s, though the ductwork remained unchanged. Black iron vents were set into the floors and walls of every room, ornate grates with Victorian scrollwork that had turned dark with age and use. I learned quickly that the vents carried sound. Standing in the kitchen, I could hear conversations from the living room as clearly as if the speakers were beside me. From my bedroom on the 2nd floor, I could hear the furnace clicking on and off in the basement, the expansion and contraction of metal as it heated and cooled. The house had its own language, spoken through those iron channels, and I grew accustomed to translating its sounds into the mundane explanations of settling wood and aging pipes. December arrived with an early cold snap that drove temperatures well below zero. The furnace ran almost constantly, pushing warm air through the ancient ductwork, fighting a losing battle against windows that had not been replaced since the Eisenhower administration. I wore sweaters indoors and slept under 3 blankets and told myself I would winterize properly before the next year. It was during the 2nd week of December that I first heard the voice. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone speaking. A woman's voice, soft and low, drifting up from somewhere below me. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, directly above the parlor where my grandmother had received guests and played bridge with her friends every Thursday for 40 years. The voice seemed to be coming from the heating vent set into the floor near my bed, a black iron grate that connected to the ductwork running through the walls. At first, I assumed it was a radio signal bleeding through somehow. Old houses with old wiring could pick up strange frequencies, or so I had been told. I lay in bed and listened, trying to make out the words, but they were too indistinct. Just a murmur, a rhythm of syllables that rose and fell like someone reciting a prayer or reading aloud from a book. After about 10 minutes, the voice stopped. The house fell silent, except for the hum of the furnace and the creak of old wood settling in the cold. I convinced myself I had been half dreaming, that tired mind creating patterns from random noise. I went back to sleep. The next night, I woke at the same time. 3 a.m. exactly, and the voice was there again. Same tone, same rhythm, same soft feminine murmur drifting up through the vent like smoke rising from a fire. I got out of bed this time and knelt beside the grate, pressing my ear against the cold iron, trying to hear the words more clearly. They remained just out of reach. I could tell it was a phrase being repeated, the same sequence of sounds over and over, but I could not make out what they meant. The voice was too distant, too muffled by the twists and turns of the ductwork that ran through the bones of the house. I checked the basement the next morning. The furnace was old but functioning properly. No strange sounds or malfunctions that might explain what I had heard. I checked the ductwork as far as I could access it, looking for gaps or openings where outside noise might enter. I found nothing. The voice came again that night, and the next, and the next. Always at 3 a.m. Always the same soft murmur. Always the same phrase, repeated with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I started sleeping with the vent covered. I found an old piece of plywood in the garage and laid it over the grate, weighing it down with books. That night, I woke at 3 a.m. to silence from the floor vent, but the voice had not stopped. It had moved. Now it came from the wall vent near my closet, the one that connected to the same ductwork system. The same soft murmur, the same rhythmic phrase, drifting through the iron grate as if the plywood over the floor meant nothing at all. I covered that vent too. The voice moved to the hallway outside my room. I covered that one, and it moved to the bathroom. I spent an entire weekend sealing every vent on the second floor with plastic sheeting and duct tape, creating an airtight barrier between myself and the ductwork. It did not help. The voice found its way through anyway, not from the vents anymore, but from inside the walls themselves, from beneath the floorboards, from the spaces between the plaster and the lath, the hollow channels that ran through the house like veins. The voice was not coming through the heating system. The heating system had simply been how I first heard it. The voice was coming from somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper. I stopped sleeping through the night. I would lie awake, waiting for 3 a.m., knowing that when it came, so would the voice. Sometimes it was louder than other nights. Sometimes it was so faint, I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. But it was always there, always the same phrase, always repeating. I started researching the house. I dug through boxes of my grandmother's papers, looking for anything that might explain what I was hearing. I found birth certificates and death certificates, deeds and tax records, letters and photographs, spanning over a century of family history. I found the obituaries. 5 women had died in this house. My grandmother, my great-grandmother before her, and before her, 3 others, stretching back to the original owner, a woman named Elizabeth who had built the house with her husband and then outlived him by 30 years. Each of them had died in their beds. Each of them had died alone. Each of them had died in winter, when the house was sealed against the cold and the furnace ran through the night. I found something else in my grandmother's papers. A letter written in her hand, dated just 6 months before she died. It was addressed to no one, more like a journal entry than correspondence. She wrote about hearing voices at night. A woman's voice, coming from the vents, speaking words she could not understand. She wrote that she had heard the voice for years, decades even, but had always dismissed it as the sounds of an old house. She wrote that recently, the voice had changed. It had become clearer, more insistent. She wrote that she was afraid she was finally beginning to understand what it was saying. The letter ended there, unfinished, unsigned, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of writing it and never returned. I should have left. I know that now. Any reasonable person would have packed their bags and walked away from a house where the dead whispered through the walls. But the house was my inheritance. It was the only thing of value I owned. And some part of me, the part that had grown up hearing my grandmother's stories about our family history, could not abandon it. Instead, I decided to listen. On December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, I knelt beside the vent in my bedroom floor and pressed my ear against the cold iron grate. I had removed the plywood and the plastic, had cleared away every barrier I had erected. I wanted to hear the voice clearly. I wanted to understand what it had been trying to tell me. 3 a.m. came. The furnace clicked off, leaving the house in silence. And then, rising from the darkness below, came the voice. It was clearer than it had ever been, not muffled anymore, not distant. The words were distinct, each syllable sharp and precise, spoken by a woman who sounded exhausted and desperate and absolutely certain of what she was saying. She was saying my name. Over and over, my name, repeated with increasing urgency. Not a greeting, not a call, a warning. The way you would say someone's name if you were trying to wake them from a nightmare, trying to pull them back from the edge of something terrible. I jerked away from the vent, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. The voice continued, my name echoing up through the ductwork, filling the room with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it changed. The phrase that had been repeating for weeks, the words I had never been able to understand, finally became clear. A sentence, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. A voice that sounded like my grandmother's, but younger, stronger, more afraid. She said, "Get out before it's too late." Over and over. My name, then the warning. My name, then the warning. Rising from the vents, from the walls, from the floors, from every corner of the house that had sheltered my family for over a century. I did not get out. I am still here, writing this in the same bedroom where 5 women before me spent their final winters. I tell myself I am being irrational, that there is an explanation for everything I have heard. I tell myself that voices do not travel through heating vents from beyond the grave, that the dead do not warn the living, that my grandmother's letter was the product of an aging mind succumbing to dementia. But every night at 3 a.m., I hear her. She says my name. She tells me to get out. She repeats it over and over, with a desperation that grows stronger as winter deepens and the nights grow colder. I have started to notice something else. The voice is closer now than it was when I first heard it. What once seemed to come from deep in the basement now sounds like it is rising from just beneath my floor. What once was muffled by layers of wood and plaster now sounds like it is whispering from inches away. She is getting closer, or I am sinking down to meet her. I do not know what waits at the end of this. I do not know what happened to the women who died in this house, alone in their beds on winter nights, listening to voices that rose from the darkness below. I do not know if the voice is trying to save me, or if it is something else entirely, something that wears my grandmother's voice the way a hunter wears a disguise. I only know that every night the voice comes. Every night it speaks my name. Every night it tells me to get out. And every night I stay. Because this is my home now. This is my inheritance. This is the house where the women of my family have always lived and died. And I am beginning to think that dying here might be the only way to finally understand what the voice has been trying to tell me. I moved into the warehouse apartment in October, 3 months before everything went wrong. The building had been a textile factory in the 1922nd, converted to residential lofts sometime in the 90s when the neighborhood started gentrifying. My unit was on the top floor, the 4th, with exposed brick walls and original hardwood floors and windows that stretched nearly floor to ceiling, letting in the gray light of a Massachusetts autumn. The rent was cheap for the area, which should have been my first warning. Nothing in that part of the city was cheap without a reason. But I was fresh out of a relationship that had consumed 5 years of my life, working a job that barely covered my expenses, and desperate for a space that felt like mine alone. The warehouse apartment, with its industrial charm and complete isolation from my previous life, seemed perfect. The building manager was a man named Victor, who lived in the basement unit and seemed to exist in a permanent state of mild irritation. He showed me the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, pointing out the original tin ceiling tiles, the updated electrical system, the radiators that clanked and hissed but kept the place warm through winter. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was an attic above my unit. I looked up at the ceiling, noticing for the first time the rectangular outline of a hatch in the hallway. It was painted the same off-white as the ceiling, sealed shut, covered in dust and what looked like decades of accumulated grime. Victor said the attic was just storage space, hadn't been accessed in years. The previous owner had used it to store old manufacturing equipment that was too heavy to move and too worthless to sell. Nobody went up there. Nobody needed to. I signed the lease that afternoon. The first month was uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, started building a life in a space that answered to no one but me. The apartment had its quirks, as all old buildings do. The radiators made noises that sounded almost like voices. The floors creaked in certain spots no matter how carefully I walked. The windows rattled in their frames when the wind blew from the north. I learned to ignore these sounds, to categorize them as the normal complaints of a structure that had been standing for nearly a century. Old buildings talk. That's what everyone says. You just have to learn their language. The footsteps started in November. It was a Thursday night, just past midnight. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, scrolling through my phone with the mindless attention of someone trying to exhaust themselves into unconsciousness. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Then I heard it, a footstep, directly above my head. I froze, my thumb hovering over the phone screen, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unmistakable, not the scurrying of an animal or the settling of old wood. A footstep, heavy and deliberate, the sound of weight being transferred from one foot to another. Then another, and another. Someone was walking in the attic above my bedroom. I listened as the footsteps crossed from one end of the space to the other, slow and measured, like someone pacing. They moved from the area above my bedroom to the area above my living room, then back again, back and forth, for nearly an hour. Then they stopped, directly above my bed, and did not move again. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from above. Nothing, just silence, heavy and oppressive, broken only by my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. In the morning, I called Victor. I told him someone was in the attic. I told him I had heard footsteps, clear as day, walking back and forth for over an hour. I told him I was concerned about a break-in, about squatters, about anything that might explain what I had heard. Victor sighed with the weariness of a man who had heard too many complaints about things that were not his problem. He said it was probably pigeons. The attic had some gaps in the roof where birds sometimes got in, or maybe rats. Old buildings always had rats, no matter how well maintained they were. He said he would put some traps up there when he got a chance, but he was busy, and it might be a few weeks. I wanted to argue. Pigeons do not walk like people. Rats do not pace back and forth with the deliberate rhythm of someone deep in thought. But I could hear in his voice that he had already dismissed my concerns, filed them away under the category of nervous new tenant, not worth his time. The footsteps came back that night. Same time, same pattern, crossing from one end of the attic to the other, then stopping above my bed and standing there in silence. I started keeping a log. Every night, I wrote down when the footsteps started, how long they lasted, where they went, where they stopped. The pattern was always the same. They began between midnight and 12:30 a.m. They paced for between 45 minutes and an hour. Then they stopped above my bed and remained motionless until I finally fell asleep from exhaustion. After a week, I bought a ladder and examined the hatch. The ceiling in my hallway was about 10 feet high, too tall to reach without assistance. I positioned the ladder directly beneath the hatch and climbed up, flashlight in hand, ready to find evidence of whatever had been making those sounds. The hatch was painted shut, not just closed, but sealed, the paint forming an unbroken bond between the edges of the panel and the surrounding ceiling. I ran my fingers along the seam, feeling for any gap, any indication that it had been opened recently. Nothing. The paint was smooth and continuous, undisturbed. I looked at the surface of the hatch itself. It was covered in dust, the kind that accumulates over years of neglect. If anyone had pushed this panel open recently, there would have been marks in the dust, fingerprints, smears, something. But the coating was uniform, a gray blanket that had not been touched in a very long time. Whatever was walking in my attic had not entered through the hatch. The footsteps continued for 2 more weeks. I tried everything I could think of. I played loud music at night, hoping to drown them out or scare away whatever was up there. The footsteps continued. I slept with earplugs, noise-canceling headphones, white noise machines. I could still hear them, muffled but present, the rhythm unmistakable beneath whatever sounds I tried to layer on top. I called Victor 3 more times. Each time, he promised to check on it. Each time, he never did. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? Someone is walking in my attic, but the only entrance is sealed shut and covered in undisturbed dust. They would think I was crazy. Some nights, I thought I was crazy. Then, on the 21st night, something changed. The footsteps started at their usual time, crossing from one end of the attic to the other with that same slow, deliberate pace. But instead of pacing for an hour, they stopped almost immediately. They moved to the spot directly above my bed and stayed there, and they did not move for the entire night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching that spot as if I could see through the plaster and wood to whatever was standing on the other side. The silence was worse than the footsteps had been. At least when it was moving, I knew where it was. Now it was just standing there, directly above me, and I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I did not sleep. I did not move. I just watched that spot on the ceiling and waited for morning. When dawn finally came, gray light filtering through the windows, I noticed something I had never seen before. A crack in the ceiling, directly beneath where the footsteps always stopped. It was small, barely visible, a hairline fracture in the plaster that I must have looked at 100 times without really seeing. But now I was looking at it, really looking at it, and something about it seemed wrong. I got the ladder. I positioned it beneath the crack. I climbed up with my flashlight, my heart pounding, my hands trembling on the rungs. The crack was wider than it had appeared from below. Not much, maybe half an inch at its widest point, but enough to see through. Enough for light to pass between my apartment and the space above. I raised the flashlight and pointed it at the crack, and I looked back. I fell off the ladder. I hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind out of me, hard enough to leave bruises that lasted for weeks. But I barely felt it. All I could see was that eye, pressed against the crack, looking down at me. It was human. That was the worst part. Not the eye of an animal, not something I could dismiss as a raccoon or a large rat. A human eye, bloodshot and wide, the iris a pale blue that caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back like a mirror. It had been watching me. Every night, when the footsteps stopped above my bed, it had been watching me through that crack, watching me sleep, watching me lie awake, watching me for 3 weeks, and I had never known. I ran. I did not pack a bag. I did not call Victor. I did not do anything except grab my keys and my phone and flee down 4 flights of stairs to the street below. I stood on the sidewalk in my pajamas, shaking, unable to process what I had seen. I called the police from a coffee shop down the street. They sent 2 officers, young men who clearly thought I was exaggerating or mentally ill. They went up to my apartment. They examined the hatch in the ceiling. They told me it was painted shut. They told me there was no way anyone could have gotten into the attic without breaking the seal. They told me old buildings made strange noises, and maybe I had seen my own reflection in something shiny near the crack. They did not believe me. I never went back to that apartment. I had a friend collect my belongings while I waited in the car, unable to even look at the building. I broke my lease and paid the penalty and moved to a different part of the city, a modern building with concrete ceilings and no spaces above me where anything could hide. But I still think about that eye. I think about it watching me through the crack, night after night, while I lay in bed unaware. I think about the footsteps that paced back and forth before settling into position, like someone checking all the angles before choosing the best vantage point. I think about what Victor told me when I called to break my lease. He said he had finally gotten around to checking the attic. He said it was empty. No pigeons, no rats, no old manufacturing equipment. Nothing up there at all, he said, nothing but dust. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, even now, in my new apartment with its concrete ceilings and modern construction, I find myself staring at the ceiling above my bed, looking for cracks, wondering what might be looking back. The storm came in faster than anyone had predicted. The weather service had called for 6 to 8 inches over 2 days, a manageable accumulation that would keep the plows busy, but not overwhelm them. What we got instead was nearly 3 feet in less than 24 hours, driven by winds that gusted to 50 miles an hour and temperatures that plummeted well below zero. By the time the worst of it hit, half the county had lost power, and the roads had become impassable drifts of white that swallowed everything in their path. I was alone in my cabin when the power went out. The place had been in my family for 3 generations, a small structure my grandfather had built with his own hands on 40 acres of woodland in the hills of northern New Hampshire. I had driven up for a week of solitude, a chance to escape the noise of the city and clear my head after a year that had left me exhausted and hollow. The cabin had no internet, no cell service, no connection to the outside world except an old landline that my grandmother had insisted on keeping even after everyone told her it was unnecessary. The landline went dead around the same time as the power. I was not surprised. The infrastructure in that part of the state was old and poorly maintained. strung along poles that had been standing since the Eisenhower administration. A storm like this would bring down lines all over the county. I would be on my own until the crews could get through to repair them. I had prepared for this possibility. The cabin had a generator that could run the essentials, a wood stove that threw enough heat to keep the main room comfortable, and enough supplies to last a week or more if necessary. I had been coming here since I was a child. I knew how to survive a few days cut off from civilization. The first night passed without incident. I kept the stove burning, read by lamplight, listened to the wind howl around the corners of the cabin. The storm was a living thing outside my walls, a beast of snow and ice that threw itself against the windows with a fury that seemed almost personal. But I was warm and safe and well supplied, and I went to sleep feeling something close to peace. The second night was different. The storm had settled into a steady assault by then, the initial violence giving way to a relentless accumulation that buried everything in white. I had ventured outside briefly to refuel the generator, fighting through drifts that reached my waist, and had returned to the cabin shaking with cold despite being gone for less than 10 minutes. The temperature had dropped to 20 below, cold enough that the snow squeaked under my boots, and my breath froze in my beard before it could dissipate. I was standing by the window in the main room, watching the snow fall through the beam of the porch light, when I saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of my property, maybe 100 yards from the cabin, right where the tree line met the cleared space around the structure. A dark shape against the white backdrop of the storm, motionless, facing in my direction. My first thought was that it was a neighbor seeking shelter. The nearest occupied house was over a mile away, but in conditions like this, people did desperate things. Someone might have lost power with no backup, might have tried to walk to safety and gotten disoriented in the storm. It would not have been the first time someone had stumbled onto my property looking for help. I opened the front door and called out. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my eyes water. I shouted into the wind, offering shelter, asking if they needed help. My voice was swallowed by the storm almost immediately, torn away and scattered into the darkness. The figure did not respond, did not move, did not give any indication that it had heard me at all. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching, waiting for some sign of life. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the snow, facing the cabin with what felt like deliberate attention. I closed the door against the cold and went back to the window. For the next hour, I watched the figure. It did not move, not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head, not the smallest adjustment that would indicate a living person standing in the cold. It just stood there, facing my cabin, as still as a statue. I began to doubt what I was seeing. Maybe it was a tree I had never noticed before, or a shadow cast by something behind it, or a trick of the storm playing with the light from my porch. I turned off the porch light to see if the figure would disappear. It remained, darker now, less distinct, but unmistakably present. I turned the light back on. The figure was exactly where it had been. The temperature outside was 20 below zero. A person standing motionless in that cold would develop frostbite within minutes. Hypothermia would set in shortly after. Within an hour, they would be dead or dying, their body shutting down as the cold overwhelmed their ability to generate heat. No one could survive standing still in those conditions for an hour. It was physically impossible, but the figure did not move. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was not a person at all. Maybe I was looking at something I had placed in the yard and forgotten about, some piece of equipment or debris that the snow had partially buried. I tried to remember if there was anything at that spot, anything that might account for what I was seeing. I could not think of anything. Around midnight, I forced myself to step away from the window. I was becoming obsessed, spending hours staring at a shape in the snow that probably had a perfectly rational explanation. I added wood to the stove, poured myself a drink, tried to read by lamplight, but I could not concentrate. My eyes kept drifting back to the window, to that dark shape at the edge of my property. Before going to bed, I checked one more time. The figure was still there. Same position, same direction, still motionless, still facing the cabin, still standing in cold that should have killed anyone within the first 30 minutes. I did not sleep well. I lay in bed, listening to the wind and the creak of the cabin settling around me, thinking about what was standing in my yard. Every time I started to drift off, my mind would jerk me back awake with images of that dark shape against the snow. Several times during the night, I got up and went to the window. Each time, The figure was there, unchanged, unmoved, watching. I woke at dawn to a world that had gone quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. The sky was clear and pale, the sun just beginning to rise over the mountains to the east. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, cold enough that the snow had developed a crust that glittered like diamonds in the early light. I went to the window. The figure was gone. I felt a moment of relief so intense, it was almost physical. Whatever I had been seeing, whatever trick of light or shadow or exhaustion had created that shape in my yard, it was over now. The dawn had chased it away, and I could pretend that the whole experience had been nothing more than a bad dream brought on by isolation and stress. Then I looked more closely at the spot where the figure had stood. The snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, no indication that anything had been standing there at all. Just a smooth, unbroken surface of white stretching from the tree line to the edge of my cleared property. I pulled on my boots and my coat and went outside. The cold was brutal, worse than it had been the night before, so intense that my lungs ached with each breath. I walked through the snow toward the spot where I had seen the figure, my feet breaking through the crust with each step, leaving deep prints behind me. When I reached the spot, I stopped and looked around. Nothing. No prints but my own. No disturbed snow. No evidence that anyone or anything had been standing there for hours in the freezing darkness. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What I was not seeing, the figure had been real. I had watched it for hours. I had seen it against the snow, a dark shape that did not move, did not waver, did not disappear no matter how many times I looked away and looked back. But there were no footprints, not leading to the spot, not leading away, nothing. I walked the perimeter of my property that morning, checking for tracks, looking for any indication of where the figure might have come from or gone to. I found nothing. The only prints in the snow were my own, fresh trails marking my passage through a landscape that showed no other signs of disturbance. The power came back 2 days later. The roads were cleared the day after that. I packed my bags and drove home, leaving the cabin empty behind me. I have not been back since. I tell myself that what I saw was a hallucination, a product of isolation and stress and the strange effects of extreme cold on human perception. I tell myself that the mind can create things that are not there, especially when tired, especially when alone, especially when the world has become a hostile place of snow and wind and darkness. But I know what I saw. I watched that figure for hours. I saw it standing motionless in cold that would have killed any living thing. I saw it facing my cabin with an attention that felt deliberate, purposeful, patient. And in the morning, when it was gone, it left no trace behind. No footprints, no tracks. Nothing to prove it had ever existed except my memory of those hours at the window, watching and waiting and wondering what was watching me back. I do not know what stood at the edge of my property during that blizzard. I do not know where it came from or where it went or why it chose my cabin to watch through the night. I do not know if it was human or something else, something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we refuse to believe. I only know that it was there, and it was watching. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment in the city, surrounded by light and noise and other people, I find myself looking out my window into the darkness beyond, looking for a shape that does not move, looking for something that watches without leaving a trace. I have not seen it again, but I am not sure I would know if I had. Some things do not need to leave footprints to prove they were there. Some things exist in the memory alone, haunting the space between what we saw and what we can explain. And some things, once they have found you, never really leave. My mother died on a Tuesday at 3:17 inches the morning. I know this because the hospice nurse wrote it on the death certificate in careful, clinical handwriting, and because I was sitting beside her bed when it happened, holding her hand as her breathing slowed and then stopped, and the room filled with a silence that seemed to have weight and texture. She had been sick for 2 years, cancer that started in her lungs and spread everywhere, the way cancer does, consuming her piece by piece while I watched helplessly from the chair beside her hospital bed. By the end, she weighed less than 90 pounds, a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin, her eyes the only part of her that still seemed alive. She tried to tell me something in those final hours. I could see her lips moving, could feel her hand squeezing mine with what little strength remained, but no sound came out, just breath. Just the rasp of air moving through lungs that had stopped working properly months ago. Whatever she wanted to say died with her, carried into whatever comes next without ever reaching my ears. I spent the next 3 years avoiding her house. I paid someone to maintain the lawn, to check on the pipes in winter, to make sure the structure did not fall into disrepair. But I could not bring myself to go inside. Every time I drove past, I would see her in the window, a ghost of memory standing where she used to stand, watching for my car to come up the driveway. Eventually, the money ran out. The house had to be sold, and before it could be sold, it had to be emptied. 63 years of accumulated possessions, sorted and boxed and donated or discarded. No one else was going to do it. I was the only family she had left. I arrived on a Friday evening in early December. The house was exactly as I remembered it, a small Cape Cod on a quiet street in a town that had not changed much since my childhood. The paint was peeling in places, the gutters needed cleaning, the lawn was brown and patchy from the winter cold, but it was still her house, still filled with her presence despite 3 years of emptiness. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not decay or neglect, but her. Her perfume, faint but unmistakable, the scent she had worn every day for as long as I could remember. Lavender and something else, something floral that I had never been able to identify. The smell of my childhood, of comfort and safety, and a love that had asked nothing in return. I stood in the entryway for a long time, breathing her in, letting the memories wash over me. Then I set down my bags and got to work. The first day was easier than I expected. I started in the garage, sorting through boxes of Christmas decorations and old tools and magazines that dated back to the Reagan administration. Mechanical work, requiring no emotional investment. I filled the dumpster I had rented, took a break for dinner, and returned to the house as the sun was setting. I had planned to sleep in my old bedroom, but when I opened the door and saw the bed where I had slept as a child, something in me could not do it. I ended up on the couch in the living room instead, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of her, listening to the house settle around me. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. I jolted awake, disoriented, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the kitchen, a harsh jangling ring that I had not heard in years. The old rotary phone, the avocado green one that my mother had refused to replace even after touch tone became standard. She said she liked the sound of the dial spinning back after each number. She said it reminded her of simpler times. I stumbled into the kitchen and stared at the phone. It was still there on the wall where it had always been, the curly cord hanging down, the handset vibrating slightly with each ring. I had not bothered to remove it during my brief visit to prepare the house for sale. I had not thought about it at all. I picked it up out of habit, the same motion I had made 1,000 times as a child, reaching up to grab the handset, pressing it against my ear. Static. Loud, hissing static, the kind you used to hear when you dialed a wrong number or when the lines were crossed during a storm. But beneath the static, something else. A rhythm, a pattern, something that might have been breathing. I held the phone to my ear, listening, waiting for a voice. None came, just the static and that faint, rhythmic sound beneath it. I hung up and looked at the phone. Then I looked at the wall behind it. The cord had been cut, severed cleanly about 6 inches from the jack, the copper wires inside exposed and corroded with age. The line had been dead for 3 years, disconnected when I canceled my mother's service after the funeral. A phone cannot ring without a connection. This is basic physics, basic reality, the kind of thing that does not require explanation. A severed line means no signal. No signal means no ring. But the phone had rung. I had heard it. I had answered it. I told myself I was dreaming, sleep-deprived, emotionally overwhelmed, caught in some half-waking state where the boundaries between memory and reality had blurred. I went back to the couch and lay there until morning, listening for sounds that did not come. The phone rang again the next night, same time, 3:17 a.m. I did not want to answer. I lay on the couch, the blanket pulled up to my chin, listening to that harsh jangling ring coming from the kitchen. 6 rings, 7, 8. It did not stop. It just kept ringing, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. I answered. Static again. But this time, something else was there. A voice, buried deep in the hiss and crackle, trying to form words. I could not make out what it was saying, just fragments. Syllables that might have been language, might have been nothing at all. I hung up and checked the cord again. Still cut, still dead, still impossible. The phone rang every night after that, always at 3:17. Always the same static, the same buried voice trying to push through from somewhere beyond the hiss. Each night, the voice was a little clearer, a little closer, a little more recognizable. By the fifth night, I could almost understand what it was saying. Single words, repeated over and over, the same phrase cycling through the static, like a recording on a loop. I pressed the handset against my ear so hard it hurt, straining to hear, needing to understand. By the sixth night, I recognized the voice. It was my mother. The same cadence, the same tone, the same way she stretched certain vowels and clipped certain consonants, the accent of a woman who had grown up in this town and never really left. I would have known her voice anywhere, in any circumstance, through any amount of interference. She was trying to warn me about something. The words were still unclear, still fragmented by static, but I could hear the urgency beneath them. She was not just speaking. She was pleading, begging me to understand something she could not quite say. I stayed up all that night, sitting in the kitchen with the phone in my lap, waiting for 3:17 to come. When it rang, I grabbed the handset before the first ring had finished. The static was lighter this time. Her voice was clearer. She said my name. Clear as day, as clear as she had ever said it when she was alive. Then she said something else, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She said, "It's still in the house." The line went dead. Not to static, to silence. The absolute silence of a severed connection, a phone that should never have rung in the first place. I sat there in the darkness of her kitchen, holding a phone that was not connected to anything, listening to silence that seemed to have depth and weight. Then I heard the footsteps. They came from upstairs, from her bedroom, the room where she had spent her final months, the room where I had held her hand as she died. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor above my head. I had checked every room in the house when I arrived. Every closet, every corner, every space where a person could hide. The house was empty. I was alone. But someone was walking in my mother's bedroom. I did not go upstairs. I did not investigate. I grabbed my keys and my phone and I ran out the front door in my socks, leaving everything behind. I drove to a motel 3 towns away and sat in the parking lot until dawn, shaking, unable to process what I had heard. I did not go back alone. I hired a company to finish emptying the house, paid them extra to do it quickly, and watched from my car while they carried out boxes and furniture and all the accumulated possessions of my mother's life. I sold the house 2 months later to a developer who tore it down to build condominiums. The phone went into a landfill somewhere, I assume. I did not ask what happened to it. I tell myself that what I experienced was grief, that the mind, when overwhelmed with loss, can create things that are not there, that I was exhausted and heartbroken and looking for connection with someone who was gone. I tell myself that the phone never really rang, that the voice was just a dream, that the footsteps were just the sounds of an old house settling in the cold. But I know what I heard. I know my mother's voice. I know she was trying to warn me about something in that house, something she had been trying to tell me since the moment she died. And I know that on the night I ran, just before I reached my car, I looked back at the house one final time. There was a light in her bedroom window, a shape moving behind the curtain, a figure that could not have been there in a house that was supposed to be empty. I do not know what was in my mother's house. I do not know if it was there when she was alive, if it was what killed her, if it was something she had been protecting me from all those years. I do not know if it followed me when I left, or if it stayed behind, waiting for the next person to sleep alone in that house at 3:17 inches the morning. I only know that some things reach out from places we do not understand. Some voices find ways to speak through silence and static and the impossible barrier of death. And some warnings come too late to explain what we are supposed to be afraid of. I never found out what my mother was trying to tell me. I never learned what was still in the house. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts, I hear the echo of a phone ringing somewhere in the distance. And I wonder if she is still trying to reach me, still trying to warn me about something I was never meant to understand. I found the mirror at an estate sale in October, 3 weeks after I moved into the house. The sale was being held at an old Victorian about 20 miles from my place. the kind of sprawling structure that accumulates generations of possessions in attics and basements and rooms that have not been opened in decades. The owner had died without heirs, and the estate company was selling everything, from furniture to silverware to boxes of photographs, showing people whose names no one remembered anymore. The mirror was leaning against a wall in an upstairs hallway, covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested it had not been touched in years. It was beautiful, even under the grime. An ornate frame of dark wood carved with leaves and flowers, the glass slightly warped in the way that antique mirrors always are, giving reflections a dreamlike quality that modern mirrors lack. The frame alone was worth more than the $15 marked on the tag. I asked the estate sale manager about it. She was an older woman with tired eyes who had probably seen 1,000 sales like this one. She looked at the mirror and then looked at me and said I could have it for 10 if I took it today. I thought she was being generous. I did not realize she was being relieved. The previous owner, she told me, had kept the mirror in that exact spot for as long as anyone could remember. It had been there when she bought the house in the 70s. The original owners before her had positioned it there too. No one had ever moved it, no one had ever wanted it, and no one had ever been able to say exactly why. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why a beautiful antique mirror had sat unsold in an estate sale, priced at almost nothing, while people paid hundreds for chipped tea sets and moth-eaten quilts. But I was furnishing a house on a budget, and the mirror was exactly what I needed for the dark hallway upstairs. I hung it that evening, positioning it at the end of the hall, where it would catch the light from the window at the opposite end. From that spot, it reflected my bedroom door, the bathroom entrance, and the closet at the far end of the corridor. The closet had been locked when I moved in, the previous owners unable or unwilling to provide a key, and I had simply left it alone. There was enough storage space elsewhere in the house. The mirror transformed the hallway. What had been a narrow, dark passage now seemed wider, brighter, more open. I was pleased with my purchase. I went to bed that night feeling like the house was finally starting to feel like home. I woke around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the window at the far end. I shuffled toward the bathroom, still half asleep, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. That was when I saw it. In the mirror, just over my shoulder, there was a shadow. Not my shadow, which stretched behind me toward my bedroom door. A different shadow, darker and denser, standing where nothing should have been standing. It had the shape of a person, tall and thin, positioned directly behind my reflection, as if it were looking over my shoulder at the glass. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway behind me was empty. Just the closed bedroom door and the darkness pressing in from both ends of the corridor. I looked back at the mirror. The shadow was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination caused by waking too quickly from deep sleep. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness. My brain was still sorting out the difference between dream and reality. There was nothing in the hallway. There never had been. I used the bathroom and went back to bed. I did not sleep well. The shadow came back the next night, and the night after that. Every time I woke and walked down that hallway, every time I caught a glimpse of myself in that mirror, it was there. Standing behind my reflection, a dark shape that seemed to have depth and weight, positioned just over my shoulder as if it were watching me watch myself. And every time I turned around, it was gone. I started avoiding the mirror. I would keep my eyes fixed on the floor when I walked down the hallway at night, refusing to look at the glass, refusing to acknowledge whatever might be waiting in its reflection. But even without looking directly at it, I could feel it there. A presence in my peripheral vision, a weight in the air, a sense of being observed by something that existed just beyond the edge of what I could see. I thought about taking the mirror down. I thought about putting it in the garage or selling it or throwing it away. But some part of me resisted. Some part of me needed to understand what I was seeing, needed to know if it was real or just a product of my increasingly sleepless nights. On the 7th night, everything changed. I woke at the usual time, around 3 a.m., and walked toward the bathroom. I had grown almost accustomed to the shadow by then, the dark shape that appeared in the mirror and vanished when I turned. I expected to see it. I was prepared for it. What I was not prepared for was what happened next. The shadow moved. Not when I moved, independently. While I stood frozen in front of the mirror, watching my own reflection stare back at me with wide, terrified eyes. The shadow behind me raised one arm, slowly, deliberately. The movement was fluid and wrong, like watching something that had learned to mimic human gestures without understanding what they meant. It raised its arm and pointed at something behind me. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could only watch as that dark shape held its position, one arm extended, pointing at something I could not see without turning around. I did not want to turn around, but I had to. I turned. The closet door at the end of the hall was open. The closet that had been locked since I moved in. The closet for which I had never found a key. The closet I had simply ignored, assuming it contained nothing important, nothing worth the effort of breaking down the door. The door was standing open, revealing a darkness inside that seemed deeper than it should have been. Not the ordinary darkness of an empty closet, but something else. Something that swallowed the faint light from the window and gave nothing back. And standing in that darkness, barely visible at the threshold between the closet and the hallway, was a shape. It was not a shadow. Shadows do not have dimension. Shadows do not have presence. This had both. It was human-shaped, but wrong. The proportions slightly off. The outline too sharp against the deeper black behind it. It was standing motionless, facing me, watching me with whatever it had instead of eyes. I do not know how long we stood there, facing each other across the length of the hallway. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. Time had stopped meaning anything. Then it moved. One step forward, out of the closet, and into the hallway proper. The movement was silent, its feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. Another step, closer now. Close enough that I could see details I did not want to see. The way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The way its edges blurred and shifted as if it were not quite solid. The way it moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence, awareness, intent. I ran. I do not remember reaching the stairs. I do not remember descending them. I just remember being at the front door, fumbling with the lock, throwing it open and sprinting out into the cold October night in nothing but my pajamas. I did not go back inside until morning. I sat in my car with the doors locked and the engine running, watching the house, watching for any sign of movement in the windows. I saw nothing, just the ordinary facade of an ordinary house, giving no indication of what waited in its upstairs hallway. When the sun came up, I went back in. The closet door was closed, locked, just as it had always been. I tried the handle. It did not budge. I got a screwdriver and removed the hinges, determined to see what was inside, to understand what I had been running from. The closet was empty, small, maybe 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, containing nothing but dust and old wallpaper that was peeling away from the plaster. But on the back wall of the closet, barely visible under the deteriorating wallpaper, someone had written something, words, scratched into the plaster itself, carved there with something sharp a long time ago. It watches through the glass. I took the mirror down that day. I put it in the garage and covered it with a tarp and told myself that was the end of it. The shadow was gone. The closet was empty. Whatever had been watching me had nowhere left to watch from. I was wrong. The shadow did not need the mirror. It had never needed the mirror. The mirror had just been how it showed itself to me, how it made me aware of its presence. Without the mirror, I could not see it anymore, but I could still feel it. Every night since then, I wake at 3 a.m. with the sensation of being watched. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something standing at the foot of my bed, something that watches without eyes, something that waits without moving, something that followed me out of that closet and never went back. I have tried selling the house. I have tried staying with friends. I have tried sleeping with every light on, surrounding myself with mirrors, doing everything I can think of to see what is watching me. Nothing works. The feeling is always there. The presence is always waiting. I still have the mirror. It sits in my garage, covered with a tarp, facing the wall. Sometimes, when I am feeling brave or foolish, or simply desperate for answers, I think about uncovering it. I think about looking into that warped glass one more time, seeing what stands behind me now, understanding what I invited into my life when I hung that beautiful frame in my upstairs hallway. But I am afraid of what I might see, and I am more afraid that this time, when I turn around, it will not disappear. Some things do not belong in mirrors. Some things exist in the spaces between reflection and reality, waiting to be seen, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for someone foolish enough to give them a way in. I gave them a way in. And now, every night at 3 a.m., something stands in my bedroom and watches me sleep. I do not know what it wants. I do not know if I will ever know. I only know that it is patient. And I know that someday, it will stop just watching. The house was built in 1952, a small rambler on a quiet street in a suburb of Minneapolis. I bought it in the spring of 2018, drawn by the affordable price and the large backyard, and the promise of owning something that was entirely mine. It was a starter home, the real estate agent said, a place to build equity before moving on to something bigger. I did not tell her I had no plans to move on. I had spent my entire adult life in apartments, listening to neighbors through thin walls, and all I wanted was silence and solitude and a space where I could exist without the constant presence of other people. The first winter in the house was brutal. Minnesota winters always are, but that year was particularly savage. Temperatures dropped to 30 below for days at a time. The wind chill made it feel even colder, cold enough that exposed skin would develop frostbite in minutes. I kept the thermostat at 70 and still wore sweaters indoors, still slept under 3 blankets, still felt the cold seeping through the walls, no matter how high the heat ran. The knocking started in January. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, when I heard it. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause. The sound was coming from the wall behind my headboard, the exterior wall that faced the backyard. Clear and distinct, not the random creaks and groans of an old house settling. A pattern, a rhythm, something deliberate. I sat up and listened. The knocking continued. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Always the same interval, always the same spacing. As if someone was standing on the other side of that wall, in the frozen darkness of my backyard, knocking on my house in the middle of the night. I went to the window and looked out. The backyard was empty, just snow and the bare branches of the oak tree, and the fence that separated my property from the neighbors. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I told myself it was the pipes. Old houses have old plumbing, and Minnesota winters do strange things to water pressure and thermal expansion. I told myself the pattern was just a coincidence, my brain finding meaning in random noise the way brains do. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. The knocking had stopped by then. It came back the next night. Same time, same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Always from the wall behind my headboard, the wall that had nothing on the other side but insulation and siding and the frozen air of a Minnesota winter. I checked the wall the next morning. I went outside in my heaviest coat and examined the siding, looking for loose boards or gaps where an animal might have gotten in. I found nothing. The exterior was solid, undamaged, showing no signs of anything that might explain the knocking. I checked the pipes. I went into the basement and traced the plumbing from the water heater to the fixtures throughout the house. None of it ran through the wall behind my headboard. The bedroom was on the opposite side of the house from the main water lines. There were no pipes there to make noise. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is. Houses make sounds. Old houses make strange sounds. I just needed to find the source and fix it. The knocking continued every night for 2 weeks. Always at midnight. Always the same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. I started setting alarms so I would be awake when it happened. Sitting up in bed, listening, trying to identify where exactly it was coming from. It was definitely the wall. Not the ceiling, not the floor, not anything else in the room. The wall behind my headboard, right at the level where my head would rest when I was sleeping, as if whatever was making the sound knew exactly where I lay. I started losing sleep. I would lie awake for hours after the knocking stopped, staring at the wall, waiting for it to start again. During the day, I was exhausted, irritable, unable to concentrate on work. I called a plumber. I called an electrician. I called a contractor who specialized in old houses. None of them could find anything wrong. None of them could explain the knocking. One night, frustrated beyond reason, I did something stupid. I knocked back. 3 knocks on the wall beside my headboard. A pause. 3 knocks again, mimicking the pattern exactly, as if I were answering a question or accepting an invitation. The response was immediate. 6 knocks. Faster now, more insistent. Not the measured rhythm of the original pattern, but something urgent, something demanding. I knocked again, 3 times. Pause. 3 times. The wall answered with a fury I had not anticipated. Dozens of knocks, so rapid they blurred together into a continuous hammering. The pictures on my walls rattled in their frames. One of them fell, the glass shattering on the floor. The knocking grew louder, more violent, shaking the entire wall, vibrating through the headboard and into the bed where I sat frozen with terror. Then it stopped. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums, that makes you afraid to breathe because any sound you make will shatter it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my living room with every light in the house burning, waiting for the knocking to return. It did not come. The next night was silent, and the night after that. 3 nights passed without a single knock, without any sound at all from the wall behind my headboard. I began to think that whatever had been making the noise was gone, that by answering, I had somehow satisfied it, or scared it away, or ended whatever ritual had been playing out in the darkness of my bedroom. I was wrong. On the 4th night, the knocking came back. But it was not coming from behind my headboard anymore. It was coming from inside my closet. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The same pattern, the same rhythm, but now it was inside the house, inside my room, inside the closet that stood against the interior wall, the closet where I kept my clothes and shoes and all the mundane possessions of everyday life. I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening to the knocking continue. It was louder now, closer, the sound of knuckles on the inside of the closet door, as if someone were standing in there among my shirts and jackets, rapping on the wood, waiting to be let out. I did not open the door. I did not get out of bed. I lay there until morning, listening to the knocking, watching the closet door, waiting for it to open on its own. It did not open. When the sun came up, the knocking stopped. I finally worked up the courage to check the closet. It was empty. Just clothes on hangers, shoes on the floor, a few boxes of winter gear on the upper shelf. Nothing that could have made the sound, nothing that could explain what I had heard. I moved to the spare bedroom that night. I told myself the original room was too cold, that the spare room had better heating, that I just needed a change of scenery. I did not admit, even to myself, that I was running from something I could not see. The knocking found me anyway. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. This time from the wall beside the spare bedroom's window. An exterior wall again, facing the side yard, just a few feet from where I lay. I moved to the couch in the living room. The knocking came from the wall behind the television. I tried the basement, setting up an air mattress in the corner farthest from any exterior wall. The knocking came from the ceiling above me. No matter where I went in the house, the knocking followed. Always at midnight, always the same pattern, always from the nearest surface to where I tried to sleep. I stopped sleeping entirely. I would stay awake until dawn, when the knocking finally stopped, then collapse for a few hours of restless unconsciousness before dragging myself through another day. I lost weight. I lost focus. I lost the ability to think about anything except the knocking and what might be making it. I started researching the history of the house. I dug through county records and old newspapers, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. The house had been owned by a family named Henderson from 1952 until 2015, when the last surviving member died and the estate sold the property. Nothing unusual in the records. No deaths in the house. No scandals or tragedies or unexplained events. But I found something else. A mention in a local newspaper from 1973, a brief article about a young man named William Henderson who had gone missing during a winter storm. He was 17 years old, last seen walking home from a friend's house about a mile away. His body was never found. The article included a photograph, a teenager with dark hair and a serious expression, wearing the kind of clothes people wore in the early 70s. Below the photograph was a quote from his mother. She said William always knocked on the door in a specific pattern when he came home. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, so she would know it was him. I read that article a dozen times, trying to understand what it meant, trying to believe it was just a coincidence, that the knocking in my house had nothing to do with a boy who disappeared 50 years ago. But I knew better. I knew that William Henderson had been trying to come home ever since that winter night in 1973, knocking on the walls of the house where his family lived, waiting to be let in, never understanding that no one was there to answer anymore. until I answered. I sold the house 3 months later. I did not tell the new owners about the knocking. I did not tell them about William Henderson or the article in the newspaper or the nights I spent listening to something knock on every surface in the house, following me from room to room. I moved to an apartment in a new building. All modern construction and thin walls and neighbors I can hear through the drywall. I thought the knocking would stop. I thought whatever had been trying to get in would stay in that old rambler on the quiet street. I was wrong. Last night, at midnight, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Pause. Coming from the wall beside my bed. The wall that separates my apartment from the one next door. I knocked on my neighbor's door this morning, asked if they had heard anything strange last night, asked if they had been knocking on our shared wall. They looked at me like I was crazy. They said they had been asleep since 11. They said they had not heard anything at all. The knocking comes every night now. Same pattern, same rhythm, same desperate, patient insistence. I do not answer anymore. I lie in the darkness and listen to it knock. 3 times, pause, 3 times, pause, and I wonder what will happen when it finally finds a way in. I answered once. I opened a door that was never meant to be opened. And now something is following me. Something that has been trying to come home for 50 years. Something that does not understand that it is dead, or does not care, or has simply decided that I am the one who will finally let it in. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. I hear it every night, and every night it sounds a little closer. I moved into the house at the end of Willow Court in September. It was the last house on a cul-de-sac that had never been completed, a development that had stalled during the housing crisis of 2008 and never recovered. 3 other houses had been built before the money ran out, but only mine was occupied. The others sat empty, their windows dark, their lawns overgrown, waiting for buyers who never came. Beyond them, the lots that had been cleared for construction had been reclaimed by nature, returning to prairie grass and scrub brush that waved in the wind like an ocean of brown and gold. I chose the house specifically because of its isolation. I had spent 15 years in the city, surrounded by noise and neighbors, and the constant press of other people's lives against mine. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted a place where I could exist without the weight of human presence pushing against me from every direction. The house delivered on that promise. My nearest occupied neighbor was almost a mile away, on a different street entirely. At night, the darkness was absolute, unbroken by streetlights or the glow of neighboring windows. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat if I listened carefully. It was everything I had wanted. It was also the loneliest place I had ever been. The first winter was harder than I expected. The cold came early that year, settling over the prairie in November and refusing to leave. By January, the temperature had not risen above 0 in 3 weeks. Snow covered everything, burying the empty lots and abandoned houses and half-finished streets under a blanket of white that glittered under the stars. I adapted to the isolation. I worked from home, communicating with the outside world through screens and phone calls. I stocked up on supplies so I would not have to venture out unless absolutely necessary. I learned to find comfort in the silence, in the knowledge that I was alone in a way that most people never experience. Then the laughter started. It was 4 a.m. on a night in late January. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, drifting in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams. The house was silent around me, the only sound the hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. Then I heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter, drifting in from outside, the kind of pure, delighted sound you hear on playgrounds in summer. Giggles and shrieks, and the joyful noise of kids at play. I sat up and listened. The laughter continued, rising and falling like music, moving somewhere beyond my walls. It sounded close, maybe in my yard, maybe in the empty lot next door. The sound of children playing in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, in a place where there were no children at all. I went to the window and looked out. The yard was empty. The snow lay undisturbed, a smooth white surface that reflected the starlight. The empty lots beyond my property were equally still, nothing moving, nothing visible that could account for what I was hearing. But the laughter continued, closer now, circling around the side of the house, moving past my bedroom window, heading toward the front of the property. I followed the sound, moving from room to room, looking out each window in turn. I never saw anyone, Just snow and darkness and the skeletal shapes of the empty houses down the street. But I could hear them. Children, laughing, playing some game I could not see in a yard I could not access. The laughter stopped around 5 a.m., fading away as suddenly as it had begun. I stood at my living room window, staring out at the emptiness, waiting for it to return. It did not. Eventually, I went back to bed. I told myself it was a dream, a vivid, realistic dream that had slipped into my waking consciousness. I had been isolated for too long, spending too many hours alone in a house at the edge of nowhere. My mind was playing tricks on me. But the laughter came back the next night. Same time, same sound, same sense of children playing just beyond the range of my vision. And the night after that, and every night for the next 2 weeks, I stopped sleeping through it. I would lie awake from 3 a.m. onward, waiting for the laughter to begin, listening to it circle my house for hours, before fading away with the approach of dawn. I would go to the windows and search the darkness, desperate to see something, anything, that would explain what I was hearing. I never saw a thing. The laughter was always the same, joyful, innocent. The sound of children who did not know or did not care that they were playing in impossible conditions. 20 degrees below zero. 4 o'clock in the morning. No parents, no homes, no explanation for their presence. I started to doubt my sanity. I made an appointment with a doctor, described my symptoms, asked if there was something wrong with my hearing or my mind. She ran tests. Everything came back normal. She suggested stress, isolation, the effects of too much time spent alone. She recommended I consider moving somewhere with more social contact. I did not move. I could not explain why, but the thought of leaving felt wrong, like running away from something I needed to understand, like abandoning a mystery that had become central to my existence. On a night in mid-February, after 3 weeks of laughter, a snowstorm blew through the region. 6 inches fell overnight, covering everything in a fresh layer of white. When I woke the next morning, the world outside my window was pristine and unmarked, a blank canvas waiting to be written on. I went outside to check. The footprints were everywhere. Small footprints, child-sized, pressed into the fresh snow, circling my house dozens of times. They went around and around, following the same path, wearing a track into the powder that was clearly visible from where I stood on my porch. I followed them, walking in the opposite direction of their circuit, trying to find where they had started or where they had ended. They did neither. They simply circled, endless loops around my property, never deviating, never stopping, never leading to or from any other location. I walked to the edges of my lot and looked at the empty fields beyond. The snow there was undisturbed, no footprints leading to my property, no footprints leading away, just the pristine white of fresh snowfall, unbroken except for the obsessive circles around my home. Something had been walking around my house all night. Something small, something that left prints like a child would leave, something that existed only within the boundaries of my property and nowhere else. I did not go back inside right away. I stood in my yard, staring at those footprints, trying to understand what I was seeing. The temperature was brutal, cold enough that my exposed skin was going numb, cold enough that my eyes were watering and my breath was freezing in my beard. But I could not stop looking at those circles, those endless, impossible circles. That night, the laughter was different. It started at the usual time, 4 a.m., drifting in from somewhere outside. But it was louder now, closer, as if whatever had been circling my house had finally decided to approach the walls themselves. And for the first time, I heard words. My name, spoken in a child's voice, mixed in with the laughter, called out in the sing-song way that children use when they are playing games, like they were calling me to come outside, like they were inviting me to join them. I went to the window. The yard was empty, just like always, but I could hear them so clearly now, so close that they might have been standing right on the other side of the glass, laughing, calling my name, waiting for me to come out and play. I did not go outside. I backed away from the window and sat in the center of my living room with every light in the house burning. I listened to them call my name until dawn, when the laughter finally faded and the silence returned. I researched the history of the land that week. I went to the county records office and dug through files that had not been touched in decades. I learned that before the development was planned, before the houses were built, the land had been a farm. The farm had been owned by a family named Larson, who had worked it for 3 generations before selling to developers in 2006. I learned something else too, something that made the blood drain from my face as I read it. In the winter of 1978, during a blizzard that dropped 2 feet of snow in a single night, 4 children had wandered away from the Larson farmhouse. They were playing a game, according to the reports. A game that involved circling the house, running around and around in the snow while their parents were inside. They got lost in the whiteout conditions. They wandered off the property and into the fields beyond. By the time anyone realized they were missing, the storm had covered their tracks. They were never found. Their bodies were never recovered. They simply disappeared into the white emptiness of a Minnesota winter, 4 children playing a game that never ended. I still live in the house at the end of Willow Court. I have thought about leaving. I have thought about it every day since I read that article, since I understood what has been circling my home every night for months. But I stay. I do not know why. Maybe because this is where they are. Maybe because someone should remember them, should acknowledge their existence, should hear their laughter even if it comes at 4 a.m. on the coldest nights of the year. They still come every night, still circle the house, still laugh and play in the darkness beyond my windows. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when fresh snow has fallen and the morning light reveals their tracks, I go outside and walk in their footprints, circling my house, following the path they have worn into the earth, trying to understand what game they are playing and why they have chosen me to play it with them. They still call my name. I have stopped being afraid of the sound. Now it just makes me sad. 4 children, lost in the snow, still playing a game they started almost 50 years ago, still waiting for someone to come outside and join them. I wonder sometimes what would happen if I did. If I went out into the yard on one of those frozen nights and let them find me. If I joined their game, circled the house with them, laughed with them in the darkness. I think about it more and more as the winters pass. And every night, when I hear them calling my name, I think about stepping outside. Just for a moment. Just to see. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that had seen better days. I moved there in November, driven by economics more than choice. The rent was cheap, the location was convenient to work, and the landlord did not ask too many questions about my credit history. I told myself it was temporary, a stepping stone to something better once I got back on my feet. The building was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, with the kind of architectural details that modern construction never bothers with. Crown molding, original hardwood floors, tall windows with wavy glass that distorted the view outside, like something from a funhouse mirror. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, according to the landlord. Personal issues, he said, nothing to do with the apartment. I should have asked more questions. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, learned the sounds of the building. The radiators clanked and hissed. The floors creaked in certain spots no matter how carefully I walked. The neighbors upstairs had a habit of playing music too loud on weekend nights. Normal things, expected things, the background noise of urban living that I had grown accustomed to over years of renting. December arrived with a cold snap that broke records across the region. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero, cold enough that the city issued warnings about frostbite and hypothermia. The wind howled through the streets, finding every crack in every building, driving the cold into spaces that were supposed to be warm. On the coldest night of the year, I saw the face for the first time. I was sitting in my living room, watching television, wrapped in a blanket because even with the heat running full blast, the apartment never quite got warm enough. The window across from my couch was frosted over, the glass covered in intricate patterns of ice that caught the light from the street lamps outside. I glanced at the window without really thinking about it, and I saw the face. It was pressed against the glass from the outside, features distorted by the frost but unmistakably human, a forehead, eye sockets, the bridge of a nose, the curve of lips pressed close to the window as if trying to see inside. I froze. My heart stopped beating. My breath caught in my throat. I lived on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, no ledge or platform or anything else that someone could stand on to reach that window. It was a sheer drop to the alley below, 20 feet of empty air between the glass and the ground. But there was a face, right there, watching me. By the time I worked up the courage to move, to cross the room and look more closely, the face was gone. I pressed my own face against the cold glass and looked down at the alley. Empty. Nothing but dumpsters and snow, and the steam rising from a vent in the neighboring building. But the window was not unchanged. Where the face had been, there was a mark in the frost, an outline, clear and distinct, where warm breath had fogged the frozen glass from outside. The shape of a face, pressed close, breathing against the window. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a pattern in the frost that my tired brain had interpreted as something human. We see faces everywhere, in clouds and shadows and random arrangements of objects. It is a quirk of human perception, the tendency to find meaning in meaningless patterns. I almost believed it. The face came back the next night. Same time, same window, same features distorted by frost, pressed against the glass, watching me from a position that should have been impossible to reach. I did not freeze this time. I ran to the window and pressed my face against the cold glass, trying to see where it had gone, trying to find some explanation. Nothing. Just the empty alley and the cold night air, and another outline in the frost where something had been breathing against my window. I called the landlord the next morning. I asked if there was any way someone could access the outside of my window. A maintenance ladder, maybe. A platform on the neighboring building. Some explanation for what I had seen. He said there was nothing. The window was inaccessible from outside. No ladder, no platform, no way to reach it without scaling the brick wall itself. He suggested I was imagining things, maybe spooked by the old building, maybe affected by the cold. I was not imagining things. The face came back every night after that, always at the same time, around midnight, always at the same window, the one that faced the alley, always pressed close to the glass, features distorted by frost, watching me with eyes I could not quite see. I stopped sitting in the living room after dark. I moved my television to the bedroom and kept the living room door closed. I covered the window with blankets, heavy fabric that blocked out the light and the view, and I hoped whatever was watching from outside. It did not matter. Even with the blankets in place, I could feel it. A presence on the other side of the glass, a weight in the air, a sense of being observed by something that should not have been able to observe me. I would lie in my bedroom and stare at the ceiling and know, with absolute certainty, that something was pressed against my living room window, breathing on the glass, waiting. On the seventh night, I heard the tapping. It was subtle at first, so quiet I thought I was imagining it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like fingernails against glass. Tap, 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 coming from the living room, from behind the blankets, from the window I had been trying so hard to ignore. I got out of bed and walked toward the sound. I do not know why. Some part of me needed to see. Some part of me needed to understand what was happening. Even if understanding came at a cost I was not prepared to pay. The tapping continued as I approached. Tap, 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 patient, deliberate. The sound of something testing the barrier between us, probing for weakness. I reached the living room door and stopped. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, I could see the blankets I had hung over the window. They were moving, swaying gently, as if pushed by a breeze that should not have existed. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The sound of a window unlocking. I knew that sound. I had heard it 1,000 times. The click of the latch turning, the soft scrape of the sash beginning to rise. But I had locked that window. I had checked it multiple times. And even if I had not, how could anything unlock it from the outside? The sound of the window opening followed. A slow, grinding sound, old wood moving against old wood, the sash rising inch by inch. I ran. I did not stop to grab my coat or my keys or anything else. I just ran out of the apartment and down the stairs and into the frozen night. I ran until I reached the end of the block, until my lungs were burning and my bare feet were numb and I could not run anymore. I turned and looked back at the building. My living room window was visible from where I stood, a dark rectangle on the second floor. The window was open, wide open, curtains and blankets billowing out into the cold air, and standing at the window, silhouetted against the darkness of the room behind it, was a figure. Human-shaped but wrong, too tall and too thin, arms too long, head tilted at an angle that no human neck should have been able to achieve. It was looking at me. I could feel its gaze across the distance between us, a weight pressing against my skin, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. Then it smiled. I could not see the expression clearly at that distance, but I knew it was smiling. A wide, terrible smile that stretched across features that were almost human but not quite. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything I owned inside and ran to a friend's house and never looked back. The landlord eventually sent my belongings to a storage unit after I paid someone else to pack them up and bring them out. I did not want to touch anything that had been in that room, in that building, near that window. I live in a different city now, a different state. As far away as I could get from that brownstone on that frozen street, I tell myself I am safe. I tell myself that whatever was at that window is still there, still watching the alley, still pressing its face against glass that now belongs to someone else. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself checking the windows, looking for a face that should not be there, listening for the sound of tapping, of glass unlocking, of something trying to get in from a place where nothing should be able to stand. I moved to a first-floor apartment. I thought it would be safer. No 20-foot drop to make a face at the window impossible. Just ground-level windows that can be reached by anyone walking past. Last week, I woke at midnight to the sound of breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, fogging the glass of my bedroom window from outside. I did not look. I pulled the covers over my head and lay there, trembling, until morning. When I finally checked the window, there was a handprint in the frost. Long fingers, spread wide, pressed against the glass where something had been trying to get in. I do not know what followed me. I do not know why it chose me or what it wants or how long it has been watching. I do not know if I will ever be able to escape it or if it will keep finding me no matter how far I run. I only know that every night, when the clock strikes midnight, I hold my breath and listen. And every night, somewhere outside my window, something is listening back. Max died on a Thursday in October, 3 days after his 13th birthday. He went peacefully, or as peacefully as these things ever go, lying on his bed in the living room while I sat beside him and stroked his fur. The vet had come to the house because I could not bear the thought of taking him to a clinic, could not stand the idea of him spending his last moments in a place that smelled of antiseptic and fear. He deserved better than that. He deserved to die at home, surrounded by the things he loved, with my hand on his head and my voice in his ears telling him what a good boy he had been. I buried him that evening under the oak tree in the backyard. It was his favorite spot, the place where he would lie in the summer shade and watch squirrels dart through the branches above. I dug the grave myself, 3 feet deep into earth that was already beginning to harden with the approaching winter. I wrapped him in his favorite blanket and laid him in the ground and covered him with dirt and stood there until the sun went down, unable to leave, unable to accept that he was really gone. Max had been my companion for 13 years. He had been there through my divorce, through the death of my father, through job losses and relocations, and all the upheavals that life throws at a person. He had been the one constant in a world that seemed determined to change. And now he was gone, and I was alone in a house that felt too empty and too quiet, without the sound of his paws on the hardwood floors. The grief was overwhelming. I had known it would be hard, but I had not been prepared for how hard. For weeks after he died, I would catch myself looking for him, listening for him, expecting to see him lying in his usual spot by the fireplace or waiting by the door when I came home from work. The absence of him was a physical ache, a hole in the center of my life that nothing could fill. December arrived with an early winter that buried the yard under a foot of snow. The oak tree stood bare and skeletal against the gray sky, its branches reaching toward nothing. I could no longer see the spot where I had buried Max. It was just a white expanse, unmarked, indistinguishable from the rest of the frozen ground. I thought the snow would help. I thought not being able to see his grave would make it easier to move forward. I was wrong. On the first night of December, I heard scratching at the back door. I was in the living room, watching television without really seeing it, the way I had been spending my evenings since October. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the noise of the TV, but something about it made me mute the volume and listen. Scratching. At the back door, the same rhythm Max used when he wanted to come inside after a night patrol of the yard. 3 quick scratches, a pause. 3 more scratches, a pause. The pattern he had developed over years of training, his way of telling me he was ready to come in. My heart stopped. For one impossible moment, I thought he had come back. That somehow, some way, my dog was alive and waiting on the porch, ready to be let inside. I stood up and walked toward the back of the house. The scratching continued, patient and familiar, exactly the way it had sounded 1,000 times before. I reached the door and put my hand on the knob. Then I stopped. Max was dead. I had held him while he died. I had buried him with my own hands. Whatever was scratching at my door, it was not my dog. I moved to the window beside the door and looked out into the darkness. There was something on the porch. It was dog-sized, dog-shaped, sitting in the exact spot where Max used to sit when he wanted to come inside, positioned perfectly in front of the door, patient and still. But something was wrong. The proportions were off. The head was too large for the body, tilted at an angle that no living dog could achieve. The legs were too long, bent in ways that did not match any anatomy I knew. And the way it sat, perfectly still, not panting, not moving, not doing any of the things a living animal would do in the cold. Then it turned toward the window. The eyes caught the light from inside the house and reflected it back at me. But the reflection was wrong. Too bright, too aware. Not the simple glow of animal eyes catching light, but something else. Something that suggested intelligence, calculation, a mind that was watching me the way I was watching it. I stepped back from the window. My hand was still on the doorknob, but I did not turn it. Something deep inside me, some instinct that existed below the level of conscious thought, was screaming at me not to open that door. The scratching continued for another hour. Same pattern, same rhythm, same sound that Max had made 1,000 times before. Then it stopped, and when I finally worked up the courage to look out the window again, the porch was empty. I told myself it had been a stray, a dog from somewhere in the neighborhood that had wandered onto my property looking for food or shelter. The strange proportions had been a trick of the darkness, my grief-addled brain seeing things that were not there. But I knew Max's scratching pattern. I had trained him to use it, and whatever had been on my porch had known it too. The thing came back the next night, and the night after that. Every night that December, around 2 a.m., I would hear the scratching at the back door. The same pattern, the same rhythm, and when I looked out the window, I would see the shape sitting on the porch, waiting to be let in. Each night, it looked more like Max. The proportions were less wrong, the posture was more natural. The way it sat, the way it tilted its head, the way it watched the door with patient expectation, all of it was closer and closer to the dog I had loved for 13 years. But it was never quite right. There was always something off. The angle of the ears, the set of the shoulders, the way it moved when it turned to look at me, too smooth, too fluid, like something imitating movement rather than actually moving. And the eyes were always wrong, too bright, too knowing, looking at me with an intelligence that no dog should possess. I stopped sleeping through the night. I would lie in bed, waiting for the scratching to start, dreading the sound and dreading the silence equally. When it came, I would pull the covers over my head and try to ignore it. But I could not ignore the feeling of being watched. The sense that something was on my porch, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when my grief overwhelmed my caution and I finally opened the door. In mid-December, after 2 weeks of nightly visits, I made a decision. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to understand what was using my dead dog's memory to torment me. I set up a camera on the back porch, positioned to record whatever appeared at my door. I ran the cable through a window and connected it to my computer so I could watch in real time without leaving my bedroom. That night, at exactly 2 a.m., the scratching started. I watched the feed on my laptop. The porch light was on, illuminating the area in front of the door. I could see everything clearly. The thing walked into frame from the direction of the oak tree, from the direction of Max's grave. It moved on 4 legs, but the movement was wrong. Too deliberate, too careful, like something that had learned to walk by watching others do it, mimicking the motion without understanding the mechanics. It reached the door and sat down in Max's spot. Then it looked directly at the camera. The face was almost perfect. The same markings, the same shape, the same expression Max wore when he was waiting for something he wanted, but the eyes were wrong. They reflected the porch light in a way that made them look like they were glowing from within, bright and cold and utterly inhuman. It held my gaze through the camera for a long moment. Then it smiled. Dogs do not smile. Not like that. Not with lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too long, too sharp, arranged in rows that went back further than any dog's mouth should go. The camera went dark. Not a power failure, not a malfunction. The image simply disappeared, replaced by static that hissed and crackled for the rest of the night. When I checked the porch in the morning, there were tracks in the snow, Dog-sized prints leading from the oak tree to the back door. But they were not dog prints. They were too symmetrical, too regular. Like the prints of something that knew what dog tracks should look like but did not quite understand how dogs actually walked. The tracks led to the door and stopped. They did not lead away. I dug up Max's grave that afternoon. I needed to know. I needed to see for myself that he was still there, that whatever was visiting me at night was not him. The grave was empty. The blanket was there, folded neatly at the bottom of the hole. But Max's body was gone. No bones, no fur, no sign that anything had ever been buried there at all. I filled in the hole and went back inside and locked every door and window in the house. That night, when the scratching came, I did not look. I did not move. I just lay in my bed and listened to it scratch and scratch and scratch, patient and persistent, waiting for me to let it in. It has been 3 weeks now. The thing still comes every night, still scratches at my door, still sits on my porch wearing something that looks more and more like my dog with each passing visit. I have not opened the door. I do not know what would happen if I did. I do not know what crawled up from that grave under the oak tree, or what it wants, or why it has chosen to wear Max's shape. But last night, something changed. The scratching stopped earlier than usual. I thought maybe it had given up, had finally accepted that I was never going to let it in. Then I heard a voice, my voice, coming from the porch, calling Max's name the way I used to call it when I wanted him to come inside. And then I heard Max's bark, the exact bark he used to make when he was excited, when he knew he was about to get what he wanted. Something is learning. Something is getting better at pretending. And I do not know how much longer I can resist the urge to open that door and see if my dog has finally come home.